All right, guys, in this lecture, we're going to cover state and local governance. We're just going to get into some basics of revenue collection and expenditure. I'm going to start with this idea called optimal fiscal federalism. This asks the question, which activities should happen at a given level of government? We have sort of three broad levels of government. Well, that is national, state, and local. We're going to use local all throughout this class, but that also has different components. These are not to be thought of as levels, but you have cities or municipalities, counties, and some states these would be called things like parishes or boroughs, and then, of course, special districts. This a really common example of this would be something like an education special district related to a school. So, the best principle, the foremost principle to achieve optimal fiscal federalism is that communities should be the ones driving their expenditure choices. We want the choices of expenditure from collected taxes to happen at the lowest level possible. So the lower, the better. We want cities and counties making decisions before states, states before national government. And this is because of a fundamental idea in public finance. And really, this is nothing special or unique to economics. But it's just this idea that communities can choose a package of services that matches their tastes of their residences and potentially improve efficiency of the deployment of public goods. This is simply to say the closer you are to a particular choice, the better it is that you can match what it is that those people want. So let's think of a situation where we're trying as a nation to decide what it is we want to do with our tax revenues. Of course, there are many hundreds of millions of opinions for here in the United States where those could be diverging not just in direction but also in scale. We might want national defense. We might not want national defense. We might want more. We might want less. We want it to look a different way. The better we can make this happen at the national level, the more efficient, right? So the better use of the resources and, right, remember the allocative efficiency idea from the previous lecture, the better we can match what it is that people actually want. Okay, so this is a core idea of classic liberalism. So this idea that people should be free, right? So I don't mean liberal as in progressive, Republican, Democrat. I mean liberal as in the American ideal of liberty, right? And this is an idea called decentralization. Decentralization means we want choices because the government, right, when it makes a particular choice, it is doing that with coercion, with force, with violence behind those choices, right? What happens if you break a rule or a law, right? You'll pay a fine, you'll end up in jail. You can even, if you, hopefully we restrict these kind of punishments to things that really warrant it, like murder, you can even be killed, right? And so when we do things with the government, it comes with a weight of force that other types of interactions do not have. And so it's very important then that we have decentralization. We see this in the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, right? So the 10th Amendment is really getting at this idea that we want choices to be made at the smallest level possible, affecting the fewest people, matching what it is that people want out of their governance most closely. So early on in American history, the federal government played a very small role in expenditures and taxation and spending. And we can see that here. This is out of the Gruber textbook, figure 10.1, the share of government spending over time, where we see back early 1900, the federal government is somewhere in the 30-35% of total spending range. It, of course, ramps up in response to World War II and the Great Depression and the New Deal, etc. There's a small dip, but then we're back here to extremely high levels in recent times. Initially, federal spending was extremely limited. It was spent on defense, which, as we discussed in public goods in the previous lecture, we have a reason to think that that is a thing the government should provide because that is a true public good, right? That is non-rival, that is non-excludable, and it's going to have the free rider problem. That's a thing that we might really want. Actually, we probably really do want the federal government providing, right? Foreign relations, right? So this is a legitimate legal operation of the federal government. You want to be able to act as a nation when you interface with other nations. This is much more difficult when we see like nation states type governance in historical situations, right, where there's many tribes or something, and it's hard for them to present a united front. So that's one potential real benefit of foreign relations being done at a national level, at a federal government level. And then, of course, a very legitimate purpose, the federal government in judicial spending, right? So in order to run the court system and have higher courts of appeals that are going to be able to decide things, right? One of the important reasons to have national government, which I'm obviously going to advocate throughout this class for limited federal government, for limited national government, because of this decentralization principle sort of at the core of American liberty values. We still do need to have the federal government for some purposes. One of these things, obviously, is the Court of Appeals system. And then a really interesting one is actually the Postal Service, right? So we really have just these four major spending categories. And, of course, now it's almost comical the number of categories that are being funded with the federal government. But the Postal Service is a really interesting one, right? Because now we wouldn't think of the Postal Service as probably being something that a federal government ought to do. We see lots of examples of private provision of this type of resource. But early on, right, when you didn't have the kind of infrastructure that was being relied on, the Postal Service actually suffered from a particular type of externality that we call network externalities, where many people being on the same system make that system more valuable. So things like Facebook would be a really classic example of this, right? So you stumble across the internet and you realize, oh, everybody's got this MySpace, but then Facebook comes along. Nobody has a MySpace anymore. Probably most of you who are listening to this never had a MySpace, maybe have never actually seen a MySpace page. This was actually fading out when I was in college. And so you jump over to Facebook and you never look at your MySpace again. Well, why is that? Is it because the Facebook product is superior? Probably. But a huge element of that is the fact that all your friends are on Facebook. None of your friends are on MySpace. MySpace is useless. Facebook is valuable. Postal Service offers a very similar type of benefit, right? Difficult for me to send a letter to someone elsewhere in the country, right? Difficult for me to ship a package, difficult for me to get important documents to a business partner on the other side of the country, maybe, if they're not on the same network, if they're not on that same system. So that Postal Service system is an example of a network externality. Okay, this brings us to a sort of an important inflection point, right? Which is 100 years ago, it used to be that local revenues were basically only comprised of the taxation that those taxing entities, the city, the county, the state, were taking up, right? But over the next 50 years, right, from 1902, something like this, to 1952, something in that range, right, we see just this explosion of what we call intergovernmental grants. So these are payments from one level of government to another. So one level of government takes up that in taxation and then sends it out to other levels of governance. And this had three big driving reasons. One of those is the 16th Amendment, which simply gave the taxing power to the federal government. They didn't used to be able to levy taxes directly on the citizenry at all. And then, of course, the New Deal in response to the Great Depression and other types of social insurance and welfare programs sprang up. And this led to a massive amount of increase at the federal level, actually state and local. And different commentators see this different ways because it's not the easiest thing to just count up. But state and local are sort of relatively stable over time in terms of the sheer volume of revenue and spending that they do. But the federal government over time, the expenditure is quite high. Remember the graph that we were looking at a minute ago is the share. So it's the percentage, right? Which is why sort of the total is obviously 100%. But if we graph this over time in terms of the total, we would see that growth in total taxing and spending happening. So it used to be that this intergovernmental grant didn't make up any of state and local spending or revenue practically at all, right? And then over time, this comes up. Now, this has a problem with, and we'll get into this later on in the class, but I just want to briefly mention it here. This creates another type of problem where the federal government can begin to incentivize things by using these intergovernmental grants. So lower levels of government they take on these sources of revenue and then they begin to rely on them, and it gives a leverage point for higher levels of government. National over state is a really common example. So for example, when the federal government wanted to raise the age for drinking, right, it had to begin to work with the different states, because that is a state level policy, to try to raise that level. In recent years, they've actually also raised the legal age for smoking, but they didn't do that in the same way. Because of the power and presence of intergovernmental grants, the federal government was able to say, listen, if you don't change this type of policy at the state level, then we're going to begin to restrict the intergovernmental grants, the funding that you're getting, in this case specifically for roads and highways. And so the states began to quickly change that policy in response to that. So it moves the decision-making power away from the local people up the chain, and gets us policies that begin to be more crude, right? They don't match the preferences of the people that are being governed as closely, because it simply cannot do that at the national level. Okay, so let's take a look here at some local revenue sources. So how is it that local governments get their taxes? The big thing in terms of taxes as they are levied is a property tax. This is straightforward, right? It's a tax on land or buildings on that land. Examples of this are commercial buildings, residential buildings. This generally is about half of all half of all total revenues to the local government, to that state or city or county government. They often get it heavily through property taxes. Okay, property taxes, of course, are very powerful because, unlike sales taxes or income taxes, it's harder to move. We'll talk about this a bunch when we get to tax incidents. It's harder to move your activity away. It's harder to avoid those taxes. Of course, it suffers from a well-known philosophical issue, right, which is, what should taxes be levied on, right? That should be levied on behaviors and choices rather than it is simply something that people would thereby own, right? So sales tax, you're making a choice to engage in a transaction. Income, you're choosing to engage in activity each time, right? Each time period. Property tax, of course, it's a one-time decision that then has implications for the rest of the time that you own it. Okay, so let's take a look at sales taxes. In Texas, the sales tax is 6.25% for the state. But then we have this idea called local option sales tax, or LOST. So cities, counties, special districts, transit authorities, I think there might be a few other examples, but those are the big four, especially in Texas. They can add on, they have this option to apply a sales tax. Usually has to be voted on by a special referendum or something like this. And you can add on another 2%. This gets us to the number that you're probably familiar with when you look at your sales taxes, right? Is that 8.25% sales tax that you probably just reflexively think of. You're going to buy something, it costs $10, and so you're naturally putting that 82 cents on top, 83 cents on top of that price whenever you show up at the register, right? And that's because you're looking at the Texas sales tax plus the local option sales tax, which is going to be maxed out in basically every situation. I remember talking to a economist who'd done some research on local option sales taxes in Oklahoma, and I think in Oklahoma, there are some cases where the local option sales taxes are not maxed out. It's not all the way up to 2%. And I don't think that's very common in Texas. Other places in the United States, of course, I'm not as familiar with. Okay, our next type of local revenue source is income tax. So Texas doesn't have an income tax. There are many other states, Florida, Alaska, for example, that don't have income taxes. Of course, many of them do have income taxes. New York, for example, Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, lots of states that do have income taxes. There are even some cities that levy income taxes. In fact, 16 states permit it. In some of those states, I think last I had looked, for example, in California, only one city has an income tax, that's San Francisco, whereas Los Angeles, I think, doesn't have an income tax. They get their tax revenues in other forms. These taxes are typically something in the range of 2 to 7%. More on that in a moment. But we have these other types of taxes as well. So I just copied over from the Texas Comptroller all the different types of taxes and fees that they have listed. You see some obvious ones jumping out here. So any of you who have changed your oil or replaced a battery in a car, you've seen things like these ones here, where you have these extra fees on top of disposal things for environmental reasons. Then you have some classics like hotel tax. Here in Amarillo, we have a minor league baseball team whose stadium was funded through an increase in the hotel occupancy tax. I had just traveled to Houston last year for a conference. They have enormous hotel occupancy taxes. I forget the rate, but the highest that I have ever seen. And so that's going to really impact the way that your tourism industry and your hotel businesses are going to be able to operate with those kind of taxes on them. Of course, we see lots of other things that we're familiar with: insurance taxes, motor vehicle taxes and fees, of course, all these types of things. There's even some really odd ones. I don't know what an oyster sale fee is, for example, why that would be levied. And then, of course, the big one, sales and use taxes, right? This is going to be one of the main ways that local and state governments collect fees. And then we have some classics, right, which are what we call sin taxes, right? So sexually oriented business fee is what it sounds like. It's an extra fee that places like strip clubs have to pay. That tax is levied because this is an activity the government wants to discourage. Same with tobacco, cigarettes, e-cigs. You put taxes on those things. We'll talk about this a bunch when we get to tax incidents. And then probably even this one here, right, emissions reduction. You can think of that as a type of tax that is designed to alter behavior. A whole bunch more of this when we get to the section on taxation. Okay, last thing that I want to talk about then is the state income tax rates over time, right? And this gets into states levying income taxes and the value of a flat rate income tax, right? So a flat rate is simply, here's the percentage. If you live in this jurisdiction and you're subject to this income tax, then you end up needing to pay that particular percentage of your income. We'll see examples in some of the cities, like I was talking about a minute ago, where something like $5 per pay period, but most of these are percentage of your income over a fixed time, usually a year. But this has a very important feature, right? Because if you have a flat rate, then raising income taxes on anybody raises income taxes on everybody. And this is an important feature of representative government, right? This helps prevent raising taxes by preventing splitting up votes. This is a classic public choice idea, right? So what happens if we have a progressive income tax, right? And we actually see this, right? So there's two brackets in the New Jersey case I'm going to talk about here in a moment, where if you have a lower and a higher bracket, I can one year say, let's raise the taxes on the higher bracket, and of course many of the people who are in the lower bracket will vote for it. If we then the year after that raise the taxes on the lower bracket, then the higher bracket will pay for it, and it's a public choice. It's a voting technique, the way that government officials can apply it in order to get a consensus more readily, to get the things passed that they want passed, right? Because government entities, they want to increase their revenue. More on this when we get to public choice later on. They're going to do that by trying to pass taxes they want them passed, right? So that's how that is going to happen. So um, it's important to avoid this political technique by having flat rate income taxation, especially at the state level. Now, let's take a look at some examples of what happens when you have two brackets. So, New Jersey adopts a two bracket progressive income tax starting in 1976. Between then and 2018, the top bracket sees a 150% increase in its tax rate, and the bottom bracket sees a 50% increase in its bracket. Connecticut actually started with a flat rate of 4.5% in 1991. They then eventually go on to split that into a progressive tax rate. It's sort of almost comical though, because the lower rate is below 20,000 for married filed jointly, right? So married couples that are filing their taxes together. We'll have more on that when we get to the lecture on how taxes work. And those rates are now, the lowest of those ranges is 5% and the highest is 7%. So we're going to see natural increase over time. So notice, right, these you might be tempted anytime we think about and talk about increases over time with these kind of things. We might be tempted to think about them as saying, well, this is just sort of inflation or things over time. Of course, it's none of those things in a situation where we're dealing with percentages, right? So if you're dealing with this percentage, that naturally scales with whatever is happening in monetary economics, right? So these are in real terms increases in what it is that the government is collecting in revenue.